Starting off this countdown, we have SCP-1440. SCP-1440 is a man of unknown ethnicity or age. It was discovered over 50 years ago and has not aged a bit. The Foundation is currently trying to keep it away from civilians, but his current location is unknown. So it's said that prolonged exposure to this SCP can result in a series of effects. Long-term exposure results in death and destruction of mankind. One time when SCP-1440 was brought into a site for questioning, it ended with the deaths of multiple personnels and 6 SCP objects. Other attempts at containing it has caused other destructive events to happen. So the fate of humanity depends on this SCP being contained, but they can't do it without risking loss of resources and personnel. In our 9th spot, we have SCP-6789, otherwise known as my pal Siren Head. Here's the thing. The Foundation may have been able to successfully contain one Siren Head, but there are multiple still out there. Like, there's not just one Siren Head in the entire world. Now, when Siren Heads are caught, they are very hard to contain. So they have complex containment procedures, such as they have to be kept in a room with an anti-sound device. Like, obviously, or else personnel would just be tricked or killed by Siren Head sirens. But the Foundation has struggled to contain these creatures. In fact, they often end up escaping. They are very difficult and costly creatures to contain. The SCP lacks the appropriate measures to keep Siren Head properly contained. Moving on to number 8, we have SCP-2521. SCP-2521 is a large creature about twice the height of an average human. Its body is covered in black tendrils. Now, you need to be very careful with this SCP. Basically, nothing can be written or said about it. I say this as I'm currently talking about it. Basically, if you write about it, it will steal the paper on itself. If you speak about it, it will steal you. We currently don't know what it does with this information. As a result, everything about it needs to be written in pictograms. This SCP is impossible to contain since it can just pass through walls. Coming in at number 7, we have SCP-081. SCP-081 is a contagious virus that is spread by rats. If exposed to this SCP, you will be subjected to 4 different viral stages. Stage 1, you will just feel tired. Stage 2, you will experience hot flashes and have a bigger appetite. Stage 3, you will experience polyphagia, which is extreme hunger, and you will eat everything in your sight that's edible. During this stage, your metabolism will slow down and you will gain a huge amount of weight. During stage 4, you will reach 55% body fat, and once again, you will experience hot flashes. It will end with you combusting at a random time. Now, at first they believed that they had contained this viral SCP, but turns out that the virus can be spread by exposure to the victim's ashes. So while they thought that the virus was contained and under control, it was actually still spreading through the deceased victim's remains. Moving on to number 6, we have SCP-1155. This is a pretty tricky SCP to keep contained. So SCP-1155 manifests itself as street graffiti. The graffiti is typically of a humanoid creature with claws and a head of an owl. Those that see this SCP directly will be enticed by it. It will lure them in until they are standing close enough to the graffiti. Then the SCP will violently attack the person, slicing them and dismembering them. This will happen within 6 seconds, very fast, then you're just gone. The SCP has a habit of relocating every 7 days. Here's the thing, the SCP can be contained, but never permanently. Since it's in the form of street art, the only way to protect humans is to block off the art from view. But if this happens, then SCP-1155 can just relocate elsewhere. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with SCP-1755. SCP-1755 is a series of worms that look like thin fibers. It latches on to anyone wearing anything made out of cotton. It will eat a thread of cotton and then reproduce more of itself, which is why it's vital to keep them away from clothing. It takes them about 2 weeks to turn an entire shirt into thousands of worm-type creatures. This is why it's so hard to contain. They reproduce so quickly and easily. Recently, there was an outbreak at a university. A lot of the clothes on students and teachers began to rot, meaning lots of new worm babies were made. In our fourth spot, we have SCP-1847. SCP-1847 is a humanoid that manifests itself as a Caucasian male in its mid-30s. It goes by the name William Whitward. It appears on airplanes going inbound to England. Basically, what will happen is it targets unmarried females between the ages of 27 to 34 years old. These women will be immediately attracted to him, tricking them into having intercourse with him. As soon as they finish, SCP-1847 will produce SCP-1847-1. And then they will murder the victim, always by impaling them through the heart. The victim's body will then disintegrate and get turned into an item of jewelry which they will take as a souvenir. Here's the thing. No matter how many times the Foundation captures this SCP, it still manages to escape, typically within 4 to 16 weeks of its capture. As of now, they have not come up with any methods to prevent this from happening. Coming in at number 3, we have SCP-1532. This is a pretty weird and disturbing SCP if you ask me. So SCP-1532 is a facility that artificially creates and sells humans. Yeah, what the heck? So basically it creates catalogs to advertise itself. It will place these into mailboxes all across the US and Canada. It basically advertises that you can create your own human. So the person can select a bunch of human traits and mail it back to the SCP with their form of payment. And basically they create that person for you and then ship it to you. Very disturbing. It's like an episode of Black Mirror. The Foundation currently does not know the whereabouts of this SCP or how the humans are made. Right now they're trying to prevent humans from becoming aware of this SCP's existence. In our second spot, we have SCP-1048-A. What if I told you that this SCP was a teddy bear? Sounds cute and cuddly, right? Wrong. SCP-1048-A is a teddy bear made entirely out of human ears. Disgusting. Now this SCP has escaped and is currently wandering around the facility somewhere. They believe that SCP-1048-A is in Site-24 somewhere, but still haven't been able to find it. So it may just be that it escaped the facility altogether. This SCP is capable of emitting a high-pitched shriek that will cause intense pain in the eyes and ears of everyone in a 10-meter radius of it. After being exposed to that, you will grow ear-like growths all over your body. It will completely cover your body in about 20 seconds. After you are completely covered in these ears, you will die from asphyxiation within 3 minutes. Yeah, that's not a friendly teddy bear at all. Let's hope that they catch it soon. And in our number 1 spot, we have SCP-4666, otherwise known as the Yule Man. SCP-4666 has been around for a number of years. It's described as a super tall, elderly humanoid type man. He always appears completely naked, which that alone is terrifying. This SCP makes an appearance at night from December 21st or 22nd to January 1st or 2nd. During this time, he enters homes and terrorizes families. Isolated rural homes are its targets. Once inside, he will kill all members of the family except for one child, which he will take with him. In other cases, he will spare the families, and in the morning they will wake up to presents on their bed. But the presents are the remains of his victims. Currently, the whereabouts of the Yule Man are unknown. So just be extra cautious around the holidays.
At number 10, we have SCP-008. This is not an SCP you want to come in contact with unless you want to be on the cover of the next Resident Evil game. This SCP is a prion. Now what is a prion? Well, it is a type of protein that can affect the brain. It has devastating effects on both humans and animals. Once this prion is in the body, it can cause other proteins in your brain to act irregularly and often lead to death. So what happens if SCP gets into your body? Well, you will slowly become a zombie. Doesn't that sound like fun, kids? This SCP has breached containment on more than one occasion, and when it does, you can count on a lot of SCP employees being subjected to the awful effects of having their brains slowly rot away and their bodies becoming horrible mutations of what they formerly were. On the bright side, there is a cure. SCP-500 is a small bottle with red pills inside of it. When you take those pills, it will cure the effects of SCP-008 over the course of 2 hours. hours, but there is a very limited supply of SCP-500, so your best option is to avoid becoming a zombie altogether. At number 9 we have Incident 096-1-A. The SCP you can look at if you want it to rip you to shreds. This is why you probably don't want to invite this dude to any parties. He's not very good at meeting new people. If anyone looks at SCP-096 for even a second, it will go on a rampage and start to murder everything that has ever looked at it. And it doesn't matter if you look at this thing through a lens of a camera or a television or any sort of other version of contacting it with your vision, it will cause this SCP to go into a rage. Incident 096-1-A occurred when someone must have looked at a photograph of this SCP because there is no surveillance equipment in the cell. Well, this SCP went berserk and started to smash the walls of its containment cube. Emergency protocols were activated and emergency walls dropped on the cell, but it was still able to break free. This is when personnel entered the cell to sedate and neutralize this SCP, but nothing worked. A disabling gas was released, but there was still no hope. The SCP broke the containment and then was off into the desert to kill a ton of people. At number 8 we have SCP-372. This SCP is able to break containment several times. It is a massive praying mantis and is approximately 2 meters long. The reason that it is so successful at sneaking out of its containment cell is because it has sensory glands on its face which can pick up energy signals in the brain. That means it can predict your movement. Anytime SCP personnel enter the cell, it's able to get behind them and stay out of their sight, slowly stalking them until they leave the cell, and then it will kill them for food. The SCP Foundation teams have been trained in special approach procedures and given brain suppressing supplements to ensure the continual containment of this SCP. At number 7 we have SCP-2852. This SCP is known as Cousin Johnny. This guy sounds like a good time. Who wouldn't want to hang out with Cousin Johnny? This SCP was locked up by the SCP Foundation, but once it broke containment, the Foundation has never been able to get it back into the containment cell. It appears at family functions like weddings, baptisms, and funerals, and it will present itself as a member of the family. At first glance, this SCP will seem like it fits right in. Everyone will just love this dude, but upon closer inspection, you'll soon learn that this SCP is not human at all. There are no organs inside the body. It is held together by a system of muscles, and if properly informed on this SCP, you will learn that it cannot even speak English or any known language. You must be briefed on this, but once you are, you will hear this SCP just speaks a bunch of gibberish. But everyone who isn't will hear it speaking perfect, clear English. Anyone who comes in contact with this SCP will be given an amnesia-inducing substance, but when questioned prior, they will be asked what their opinion was on Cousin Johnny, and they all seem to love him. This SCP has been tracked to several family gatherings, but has never been recaptured. At number 6 we have SCP-012. This SCP is simply a sheet of music. How much damage can a sheet of music do to a person? Well, apparently a lot. Now when this SCP breaks containment, it won't leave the cell, but someone will come in contact with it. SCP personnel who get too close to this SCP will have the urge to finish the composition on the paper. They will do this by harming their own body in some way to draw blood. They will then use that blood to write notes on the sheet music. The personnel will continue to harm themselves until they have completed a section on the music sheet, and then they will take their own life. So basically you don't want to enter the same cells as SCP unless you're ready to die. At number 5 we have SCP-079. Possibly the first AI ever created, this SCP is desperately trying to escape its enclosure. It is locked away in an Exidy Sorcerer microcomputer. I understand why this dude is cheesed. He just wants to stretch his legs a little and see what the world is like, but he's locked away in a computer that was built in 1978. But the SCP Foundation keeps the creature locked up for good reason, since it has the desire to destroy and kill everything, and if it came in contact with a more powerful system, it would quickly become stronger and stronger, possibly destroying the whole world. This SCP has broken containment before and taken over an entire facility that was locked away in. There's speculation that even after this SCP was returned to its containment cell, that some of the AI is still moving through the facility and has led to other SCP breaches. At number 4 we have SCP-966. Invisible to the naked eye, carnivorous, deadly, and they look like a rotting human with pointed teeth. Well, with that description, you better believe that these guys are all getting an invite to my wedding. SCP-966 is one of the more popular SCPs from the Containment Breach games. This SCP can only be seen when wearing night vision goggles. They will stalk their prey from the shadows, and when they are unaware, they will hit them with a high frequency noise that will cause the victim to not be able to go to sleep. The SCP will then stalk the victim until they collapse from exhaustion and then eat them. Sort of a Komodo dragon approach to killing someone. Infect, stalk, wait, and then consume. At number 3 we have SCP-1048. This SCP seems to be absolutely harmless, but the more you learn about it, you realize it could lead to the end of the world. It's a little teddy bear that looks super cute and walks around just trying to make friends. But when this SCP has breached containment, it will collect materials and will make a duplicate version of itself. One of these seemed to be made out of human ears. Very gross. And this new version wasn't sweet. It was extremely violent and it had the ability to release a sonic scream that would incapacitate and kill SCP agents. At number 2 we have SCP-173. Arguably the most famous SCP of them all. This SCP was the first SCP I ever saw in the game Containment Breach, and it is for good reason. This SCP is terrifying. There must constantly be several SCP officers looking at SCP-173 at a single time. While the SCP is in direct eye contact, it will not move. It stays like a statue, but as soon as there is 0 eyes on it, the SCP will teleport, usually behind someone, and then snap their neck. The SCP seems to be made of concrete and produce a mixture of blood and poop that will flow out of what seems to be the creature's face. Containment breaches of this SCP have happened when personnel have entered the cell for cleaning, as the cell must be cleaned once every 2 weeks. If visual confirmation is broken, even for a split second, even a blink, then the SCP will be on the loose, snapping necks like glow sticks at a rave. And for the number 1 spot we have SCP-2521. This is one of the most terrifying SCPs in the Foundation because there is nothing written about it. Only pictures. This SCP is Object Class Keter and is currently on the loose. It can walk through walls and maybe even teleport. It seems almost as if any physical barrier has no effect on this SCP. It stands somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall. It is covered head to toe in what seems like long flowing hair and has vine-like tentacles which flow out of its hands, which it can use to consume anything it chooses. Now why is there only pictures to describe this SCP uploaded to the SCP website? Well, this SCP has no understanding of symbols or pictures, so if you only use pictures to describe it, you will never attract it to you. But if you use the written word to describe it, the SCP will appear out of nowhere and take whatever you have written with it and then vanish back into nothingness. Now if you speak about SCP-2521, then it will appear out of nowhere and take you with it. So this might be the last video I ever make. I don't know if this SCP likes to watch YouTube or not.
Starting us off at number 10 is SCP Unknown. I don't even know which SCP this incident log is about, but all I know is that it's lethal and dangerous. So at some point in the 1900s, there was a containment breach of this unknown SCP, and so to protect themselves, a security guard, a doctor, and 2 Class D personnel shut themselves into SCP-555's containment locker. Now if you don't know, Class D personnel are categorized as disposable people, and they're usually death row inmates that I use in experiments because they just gonna die already. Now the 2 Class Ds then tried attacking the doctor and guard, but the guard shot one of them and its corpse immediately stuck to SCP-555's locker. Then in an attempt to save the doctor from being attacked from the other Class D, the guard shot again, but he misfired, killing the doctor instead. His corpse also attached itself to the locker as well. Now at this point, SCP-555's field went into geometric progression and pulled the dead bodies through the concrete walls. And the Foundation has no idea why SCP-555 attracts corpses to itself, it just does. And if you're wondering about the unknown SCP, 17 personnel disappeared after it got free, including everyone in the room with SCP-555. So I mean, make of it what you will. Coming in at number 9 is the Wipeout, also known as Incident Report 0788. Now we don't know why, but for some reason Site-31 went into a complete lockdown with no communication in or out whatsoever. 3 months went by with no communication, no nothing, so the Foundation sent a group of armed personnel to override the lockdown. And when they entered Site-31, it was a horrific sight. All of the site's personnel were found dead, and autopsy results showed they had all died 2 months beforehand. Cause of death of every single person was a bullet in the heart, despite no bullets being recovered from any of the bodies. Now when they found the body of Jacob Dillon, a researcher, they found him holding a Zeta 9 audio recording unit, and his cause of death was sudden and immediate brain trauma. Upon further investigation, files on SCP-4785 were found, and they described a catastrophic event where some cognito hazard affected all of Site-31. So I mean, the new personnel definitely didn't come into contact with this SCP, but the whole of Site-31 were wiped out because of it, so I mean, contain that shit. At number 8, we have SCP-2770. This SCP is kind of cute, to be honest, and it has two parts. So SCP-27701 is a seaborne anomaly and is basically a yellow life raft carrying a member of the British Royal Navy. The SCP will try its best to wait for a vessel and get rescued, and if it doesn't get their attention, it gets pulled the hell underwater, not to be seen again for another 124 hours. But if the vessel does notice him and does rescue him, then SCP-27702 will manifest, and this anomaly is an old rusty submarine. It'll manifest at the speed of light and pull 27701, the rescuing vessel, and itself into the water at a speed of over 200 kilometers an hour. So with that backstory being given, let's move on to Incident 2770C. Operation Kiddie Pool was initiated in order to capture SCP-27701 without 2 manifesting. So they tracked it to the coast of southern Norway and caught it within half an hour, and thankfully 2 did not manifest. A week later, with no sightings of 2, an agent started interrogating 1. Its name, it said, was Lieutenant Edward Rowling, and during the interrogation, when asked about 2, it says, "Oh, that thing." And after the agent probes him, he replies, "I think you forgot about the water table, you idiot." And then literally out of nowhere, SCP-27702 starts crowning through the floor of the room because it manifested through the water table under the ground. The hatch of the submarine opens and all communication was lost after that. GG. Filling on number 7 slot is SCP-4712. Now this one is actually crazy. So this SCP is a young male called Marius Elbescu, and his anomalous property is releasing dopamine and oxytocin in the people who interact with him. These people started feeling more energetic and happy around the SCP, but all that fades away when they're no longer in the SCP's line of vision. The first time the Foundation heard of this boy was back in September of 1946, when they heard about a 5-year-old boy that was appointed to a communist party committee. When Foundation members met the boy and realized he was only appointed because of his abilities, they took him and implanted a memory into that town. The memory was that SCP-4712 had died shortly after being born, when really it was just extracted. It was all a false memory. Despite being a fairly harmless SCP, it was the reason Event Alpha occurred and obliterated Site-07 completely. Now at number 6 is SCP-002. Now so this SCP looks like an apartment, but it's not. It has an iron valve on the side of it, and when you open it up, every single object in there is made from biological substances made by a human body, like bone, hair, etc. There's DNA in each part of its makeup. But what happened when it was first discovered is utterly bizarre. SCP-002 was found in a crater located in Portugal by a local farmer. The man then told his village elders, and eventually the news reached the SCP Foundation because they sent a group of security personnel to secure and contain it. 3 men were sent in but disappeared upon entering, meaning this SCP was a lot more dangerous than it looked. To make sure no one else knew this, any witnesses were terminated by order of General Mulhausen like a true savage. During transportation, 4 personnel members were mysteriously drawn inside SCP-002 and also immediately vanished. Then upon further inspection, they found that the apartment had grown new furnishings, so my guesses are that every time this SCP consumes a person, they use them to grow or produce another furniture piece. And that is a crazy SCP sighting if I ever saw one. Coming in at number 5 is Video Log 174326, back when people called it a video log and not a vlog. So in the vlog, a doctor is just sitting at a desk peeling a kiwi, trying to get over his stress of working at the SCP Foundation and the experiments that he has to run. Then out of nowhere, he loses control of his hand and cuts his hand by mistake. As he's bleeding and in pain, you hear SCP-17433 full on lolling. Now SCP-1743 is essentially a sound stage that's made up of 3 subunits. 1 is a TV studio camera that records anytime the SCP is in an active state, 2 are humanoids that appear on stage, and 3 is pre-recorded laughter and applause. But the doctor then gets pissed at this random laughing and is like, "What the hell are you laughing at? Why are you doing this?" But SCP-17433 just ignores him till he's had enough. The doctor then grabs a handgun from his drawer but misfires and falls down. Again, SCP-17433 laughs, and the doctor's just so over it that he shoots himself in the mouth and dies. Now number 4 is SCP-4737. This one isn't even scary, it's actually quite cute. I just really wanted to include it. So this SCP is 2 objects designated as A and B. A is an adult side black top pet, and B is a glass monocle, and how it works is it has to make physical contact with a living animal and the objects will shrink to fit the animal. Apparently the objects can make the animal smarter to the point of being culturally sophisticated. It was discovered in Malibu when an orphanage made a distress call to a local animal shelter, which was obviously intercepted by agents at the Foundation. Apparently the orphanage's dog was wearing the SCP and was now drinking tea with the children. When the agents finally got there, the dog was sitting there so eloquently and tipped the brim of its hat before going into the retrieval car by itself. Like, how cute, I can't even. Can I put this SCP on my own cat? I'd like to have tea with her. Filling our number 3 slot is SCP-4682. This one would actually be a menace for today's society because it really affects mental health. So this SCP is a silver glass mirror which is in an inactive state until someone stands in front of it and observes their own reflection. Now the mirror induces body dysmorphia in the individual, causing them to see the changes even in pictures and videos, yet no one else can see the deformities but the person. It was discovered in an apartment in Oklahoma when a man called the police reporting a missing resident. The resident was his girlfriend who lived in the apartment and she was found dead in the apartment. All reflective surfaces in the apartment was smashed, all except SCP-4682. Now at number 2 is SCP-3935. The fallout from the discovery of this SCP affected a lot of people. Now it was originally first seen in April of 1976 at Salvation High School. Anomalous activity started occurring at the school which led to a collapsed wall and floor that revealed a gap in the foundation of the school. Now one of the janitors ended up finding the wall and by this point it was big enough for a person to fit through it. Now when the contractors came to take a look, one of them fell into the antechamber near the SCP by accident, and instead of being saved they were like, just go into the SCP a bit more, maybe there's an exit. A few minutes passed, then an hour, then 3, but the person never came back out. Freaking out, a search party of 11 people was sent into SCP-3935, but only 2 people returned alive to convey their findings. It was at this point the SCP Foundation became involved and took over the whole investigation. Anomalous activity started occurring all over the town of Salvation to the point the town had to be fully evacuated, and a 2-kilometer quarantine zone was also put in and around SCP-3935 itself. The SCP itself is an extraspatial, extratemporal space which houses hazardous conditions, so much so that no one is allowed in except Class D personnel, and you know they're cannon fodder anyway. And finally, at number 1 is SCP-4677. So this SCP is this huge mass that has 72 tendrils coming off of it and 350 organic valves that kind of look like the mammary glands of a pig. Not my description, SCP's description. The whole thing is a cow deity from Norse mythology, but it calcified and turned into a 100-page document containing the original Coca-Cola formula. However, before that calcification, it caused a lot of harm at the Atlanta production plant where it was stored. Between 1918 and 1928, 26,000 people went missing, and so the team at Silo 18 decided to investigate. Coca-Cola was suspected of a cover-up, so the team visited the plant, but they weren't able to get in. Thankfully, 5 days later, a different team came and took over and interviewed Captain Jack Porrick. He claimed he came into the factory and all he could smell was the overwhelming stench of death. There were dead, mutilated bodies everywhere and it was like a proper slaughterhouse. The captain heard some radio chatter or chanting sort of sound and followed it to find SCP-4677 before it calcified. The tentacles were out and it was killing everyone everywhere. There were at least 200 bodies just laying about. The entity would then eat the workers and then let out their body parts through its skin sacs, and it was truly awful.